What we are witnessing today in Gaza is nothing short of a humanitarian emergency, one that is unfolding in real time before the eyes of the world. The announcement of a so-called final evacuation has plunged an already dire situation into unprecedented levels of fear, desperation, and human suffering. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble. And now those who have survived the relentless bombardment are being forced to flee with nowhere safe to go. Families are walking through streets filled with dust and debris, clutching their children and carrying whatever little they can, not knowing whether the next step will lead them to safety or into even greater danger. This is not an orderly relocation. This is a mass displacement of people under siege, stripped of their basic human rights, and treated as if their lives are expendable. Every day that passes in this crisis is another day where innocent civilians bear the brunt of violence they did not choose and cannot escape. For weeks, Gaza has been cut off from the basic lifelines that sustain human existence. Food supplies have dwindled to alarming levels, forcing families to ration meager portions or go without meals altogether. Bread, once a simple daily staple, has become a luxury. Clean water is increasingly scarce, leaving children dehydrated and families desperate. Hospitals are overwhelmed, under-resourced, and in many cases, targeted or forced to evacuate themselves. Doctors are performing surgeries without anesthesia, making impossible choices about who to treat and who must be left unattended because the supplies simply are not there. The sick and injured, who should be under the protection of international humanitarian law, are now among the most vulnerable. Mothers give birth in shelters with no medical care. Infants lie in incubators without electricity to keep them alive. And countless patients face death not because of their injuries alone, but because medicine has run out. This is a humanitarian catastrophe that transcends politics and borders. It is a crisis of human dignity, of human survival. The announcement of a final evacuation compounds this nightmare. When entire populations are told to leave, the question that immediately arises is to where? Gaza is already one of the most densely populated regions in the world, with nowhere open for safe refuge. Pushing people from one part of the city to another only concentrates their vulnerability, exposing them to continued strikes, disease, and starvation. Evacuation without safe passage is not a solution. It is another form of violence, an extension of siege conditions that trap people between death at home and danger on the road. In such circumstances, evacuation is not about safety. It is about forced displacement. It is about uprooting lives, severing people from their communities, their histories, and their futures. This is why the international community has repeatedly recognized forced displacement under armed conflict as a violation of humanitarian principles. Yet here, it is happening openly, brazenly, and under the gaze of a world that too often chooses to watch in silence. The human cost of this crisis is not limited to numbers, though the numbers themselves are staggering. Each statistic represents a child who will never again play in the streets of their neighborhood, a mother who has lost her family, a father who no longer has the means to provide. When we say thousands have been killed, we must understand that behind every single death there is a story cut short, a family shattered, a community torn apart. And when we say hundreds of thousands are displaced, we must picture the lines of exhausted people. Elderly men and women unable to walk, children crying from hunger and fear, people with disabilities left without support, all moving through a landscape of ruins with no certainty of where they will sleep tonight. This is what the final evacuation means in reality. It is not an announcement of safety, but a declaration of despair. Humanitarian workers on the ground face impossible conditions. Aid convoys are blocked or restricted. Warehouses of supplies sit across the border unable to enter, and international agencies warn that time is running out. And every day that fuel is denied, hospitals shut down vital equipment, water pumps stop working, and shelters grow more unbearable. Sanitation collapses, raising the risk of outbreaks of disease in already overcrowded camps. Without urgent humanitarian access, this crisis will not only deepen, it will spiral into catastrophe of historic proportions. The moral question for the world is clear. How much longer will we allow this to continue? How many more pleas for help will be ignored before action is taken to alleviate the suffering of civilians who have no say in this war? To describe this as a humanitarian emergency is not to exaggerate. It is to recognize the reality that millions of people are now trapped in circumstances no human being should endure. Gaza has been described as an open-air prison for years, but today that prison is collapsing in on itself, with those inside left to suffocate. We are witnessing collective punishment, the stripping away of the right to shelter, the right to food, the right to water, and ultimately, the right to life itself. There is no justification for starving civilians, no justification for cutting off medical care, no justification for turning entire cities into battlefields where children grow up under constant fear of death. This crisis demands more than words of sympathy. It demands concrete action. Humanitarian corridors must be opened immediately, without obstruction, to allow the flow of food, water, medicine, and fuel. Civilian infrastructure, especially hospitals and shelters, must be protected, not targeted. The principle of humanity, which forms the core of international humanitarian law, must be respected and upheld. We cannot allow legal technicalities or political rhetoric to overshadow the simple truth that innocent people are dying in avoidable circumstances. To ignore their plight is to abandon the very values of compassion, justice, and solidarity that bind us as a human family. The evacuation order, framed as a step towards security, is in truth a warning sign of even greater tragedy. If the world fails to respond with urgency, the toll on civilians will grow exponentially, and the stain on our collective conscience will be permanent. History will remember how we reacted in this moment, whether we stood by as a population was displaced and left to starve, or whether we raised our voices and demanded that their humanity be recognized. The people of Gaza are not numbers on a chart, not pawns in a political game. They are men and women, children and elders, whose lives matter, whose dignity must be preserved, and whose suffering must be alleviated. This is not just Gaza's crisis, it is a test of global humanity. The siege, the starvation, the forced evacuation, they are a mirror reflecting what happens when indifference takes root. When the cries of the vulnerable are drowned out by political debates, when human life becomes collateral damage in endless cycles of conflict. If we are to hold on to our humanity, if we are to stand for something greater than violence, then we must see the people of Gaza not as distant victims, but as part of our shared human story. Their suffering should compel us to act, to speak, to demand that compassion outweighs cruelty, that justice outweighs destruction, and that humanity prevails over hate. And so, as we witness this moment, let us not be silent. Let us recognize the humanitarian emergency for what it is, a cry for urgent relief, for dignity, for life itself. The people of Gaza need more than our sympathy. They need our solidarity and our action. Let us not fail them now. The announcement of a so-called final evacuation from Gaza does not simply signal another tragic chapter in a long conflict. It marks an escalation that carries grave implications far beyond the borders of Gaza itself. What we are witnessing is not just the displacement of families or the destruction of neighborhoods. It is the intensification of a conflict that threatens to destabilize an entire region. Each move, each new order, pushes this crisis into more dangerous territory, raising the stakes for all parties involved and bringing the world closer to a point of no return. To see Gaza City under siege and its people ordered to leave en masse is to see the reality of a war that no longer spares anyone, not even those who are unarmed, unprepared, and uninvolved. When entire cities are besieged and civilian populations are forced from their homes under threat of annihilation, the implications are vast. This is not simply a humanitarian crisis. It is a profound challenge to the foundations of international law and to the moral order that binds nations together. The forced displacement of civilians under bombardment and without safe passage cannot be viewed in isolation. It sets a precedent that erodes global norms designed to protect the vulnerable in times of war. When such violations go unchecked, they signal to other powers and actors around the world that the rules can be bent, ignored, or abandoned altogether. In this sense, the escalation in Gaza is not confined to one region. It reverberates globally, weakening the principles of accountability, justice, and restraint that are meant to guide the conduct of nations. The regional risks of this escalation are immediate and real. Gaza sits at the heart of a conflict that has already drawn in neighboring territories, and every new strike, every new order of evacuation increases the likelihood of spillover. The borders of Lebanon, the tensions in the West Bank, the wider unrest across the Arab world, all of these are sensitive fronts that can ignite if Gaza's plight continues without resolution. For decades, this conflict has been a flashpoint in the Middle East, a source of anger, division, and resistance. The present escalation risks pushing it into a wider conflagration that could involve multiple actors, both state and non-state, and destabilize a region already fraught with turmoil. What begins as the siege of a single city can quickly spiral into violence across borders, pulling millions more into the cycle of suffering and loss. Moreover, the message that is being sent to the people of the region is one of abandonment and injustice. When civilians in Gaza are bombed, starved, and displaced, when they see no real protection from international law, when their cries are met with empty statements instead of decisive action, the anger and resentment spread far beyond Gaza itself. It breeds despair, but also fuels extremism. It creates the conditions in which peace becomes harder to achieve, because trust in any negotiation, any promise of safety, is eroded. For the people of the Middle East, the images of children buried under rubble, of hospitals collapsing under siege, are not distant tragedies. They are daily realities that reaffirm a deep sense of injustice. And when injustice festers, it becomes a seed for future conflict. This escalation is also deeply dangerous for the credibility of the international community. Time and again, global leaders have pledged their commitment to human rights, to peace, to the protection of civilians in war. Yet in Gaza, we see those commitments falter. We see laws ignored, resolutions bypassed, and humanitarian principles treated as negotiable. What message does this send to the world? It says that power, not law, decides whose lives are protected and whose lives can be sacrificed. It says that some populations are deemed worthy of empathy and protection, while others are left to endure bombardment in silence. Such double standards corrode the legitimacy of international institutions and weaken the very idea of a global order based on fairness and justice. But the escalation in Gaza is not only a military event, it is a political one. Every order of evacuation, every tightening of the siege is a political statement about who controls life and death, who is allowed to stay and who must leave. It is a message written not only to the people of Gaza, but to the entire region and to the world. And the message is clear, that the suffering of civilians can be leveraged as a tool of war, that collective punishment can be disguised as security, that mass displacement can be framed as necessity. If such logic is accepted, the implications are chilling. Other conflicts will follow this path. Other populations will be treated in the same way, and the cycle of violence will become harder to break. Beyond the immediate devastation in Gaza, we must also consider the longer-term consequences of this escalation. Entire generations of children are growing up amidst trauma and loss, carrying the scars of displacement and violence into the future. Their sense of identity, their view of the world, their hopes for peace, these are all being shaped in this crucible of war. A society cannot heal when its foundations are repeatedly shattered, when its families are torn apart, and when its people are left to feel abandoned by the global community. The evacuation of Gaza is not just the emptying of homes. It is the tearing of the social fabric, the dismantling of community life, the erasure of continuity and belonging. These are consequences that will resonate for decades, making reconciliation and peace infinitely harder to achieve. The escalation also poses risks to countries that may not be directly involved in the conflict. Energy markets, trade routes, global security, all of these are interconnected, and all of these are vulnerable to instability in the Middle East. The siege of Gaza and the displacement of its people may appear, to some, as a local crisis, but its ripple effects are global. In a world where conflict in one region can trigger economic shockwaves across continents, ignoring the escalation in Gaza is not only morally unacceptable, it is strategically short-sighted. Peace and stability in the Middle East are not luxuries for the region alone. They are essential for the stability of the world. To view the siege and evacuation of Gaza only through the lens of immediate tactics is to miss the broader picture. This is not simply about military operations or short-term objectives. It is about whether the world will allow the erosion of laws and norms that protect civilians. It is about whether we accept a future where entire populations can be uprooted with impunity. It is about whether we recognize that every escalation without accountability plants the seeds of future wars. What is at stake here is not only the fate of Gaza, but the fate of international order itself. We stand at a dangerous crossroads. To allow this escalation to continue unchecked is to risk not only the destruction of Gaza, but the unraveling of the fragile stability of the region and the undermining of global principles that safeguard humanity. If the world does not act decisively to halt this trajectory, we may find ourselves facing consequences that reach far beyond what we can now imagine. The evacuation order, framed as a measure of security, is in truth a signal of instability, a warning that the fire is spreading and that no one will be untouched by its flames. The future of Gaza, the stability of the Middle East, and the credibility of the international community are all bound together in this moment. The escalation we see today is not inevitable. It is the result of choices. And it is within our power, collectively, to choose a different path. But that choice must be made now, before the cycle of violence deepens beyond repair. Let us remember, when a city is besieged, when a people are displaced, When laws are broken and the world looks away, the cost is never confined to the victims alone, it is borne by us all. At this moment in history, as Gaza City remains under siege and its people are ordered into what is called a final evacuation, the world faces a moral test. It is not only the people of Gaza who are being judged by the conditions of war, starvation and displacement, but also the international community itself. The question is whether humanity, in all its diversity and power, will rise to its responsibility, or whether it will shrink from action, choosing silence or political convenience over the defense of life. The duty to act transcends politics, it transcends alliances, and it transcends geography. This is about recognizing our shared responsibility toward civilians trapped in war, and about realizing that the choices made today will echo for generations. The people of Gaza are calling out not only for sympathy, but for solidarity. They need more than words of concern, more than carefully balanced diplomatic statements. They need protection and action. When hospitals are bombed, when children are buried in rubble, when families are driven from their homes into overcrowded shelters without food or water, it is not enough to say that the situation is tragic. Tragedy implies inevitability, something that could not be prevented. But this crisis is not inevitable. It is the product of choices, of strategies, of decisions made by those in power. And because it is made by human hands, it can be changed by human will. The duty of the international community is to intervene diplomatically, to open humanitarian corridors, to demand respect for international law, and to make clear that the deliberate suffering of civilians will never be tolerated. History has shown that silence in the face of mass suffering is complicity. When people are starved, displaced, or killed, and the world looks away, the silence itself becomes part of the violence. We cannot repeat the failures of the past, when entire populations were left to endure horrors because powerful nations refused to act, or because the cries of victims were drowned out by politics and indifference. The situation in Gaza today is such a moment. The forced evacuation, the siege, the hunger. These are not isolated events. They are the marks of a population under collective punishment. To remain silent is to endorse the continuation of that suffering. To delay action is to accept that children will die tonight because food, water, or medicine did not reach them. This is not a matter of political debate, but of human conscience. There are those who say the situation is too complex, that the conflict has gone on for decades and that nothing can be done. But complexity cannot be an excuse for inaction. Yes, the history is long, the grievance is deep, and the politics tangled. Yet amidst all of that, the suffering of civilians is simple and clear. A child without water is not complex. A mother grieving over her lost family is not complex. A hospital without fuel is not complex. The international community must strip away the layers of excuses and recognize the reality before our eyes. Innocent people are dying, and they must be protected. The call to action is not to solve every political issue overnight, but to prevent further civilian suffering now, and to build the foundation for peace tomorrow. Diplomatic efforts must rise to the urgency of this moment. Ceasefire negotiations are not a sign of weakness, but of humanity. They are not about rewarding one side or punishing another. They are about saving lives and preventing a catastrophe from deepening further. Every day without a ceasefire means more lives lost, more families shattered, more children traumatized. The international community has the tools of diplomacy, the power of negotiation, and the influence of collective pressure. What it requires is the will to use them. This is not the time for hesitation, but for courage. The responsibility does not fall only on governments and leaders. It falls on all of us as global citizens, civil society, humanitarian organizations, religious leaders, academics, journalists. Every voice matters in shaping the moral response of humanity. When ordinary people around the world raise their voices, when they refuse to allow silence to normalize suffering, they create the pressure that leaders cannot ignore. The people of Gaza must know that they are not alone, that their cries are heard, and that there are millions who refuse to accept their suffering as normal. Solidarity is not just a sentiment, it is a force that can drive action. We must also recognize that the protection of civilians in Gaza is not only about this one moment. It is about the kind of world we want to live in. If we allow collective punishment, forced displacement, and starvation to go unchecked, then we are setting a precedent that can be used in other conflicts, in other regions, against other people. The erosion of humanitarian law anywhere threatens human security everywhere. That is why the world cannot afford to ignore Gaza. Protecting civilians, there protects the principle that civilians everywhere must be shielded from the horrors of war. The defense of life in Gaza is the defense of human dignity itself, across borders and across time. The role of the international community is not only to stop the immediate violence, but to prepare for peace. Peace is not built on the ruins of bombed cities or the displacement of millions. Peace requires justice, security, and dignity for all. That means listening to the voices of those who have suffered, addressing the root causes of the conflict, and ensuring that the cycle of violence is broken rather than perpetuated. The people of Gaza deserve not just survival, but a future. They deserve the chance to rebuild their homes, to educate their children, to live without the constant fear of war. The international community must commit not only to end the siege today, but to support the rebuilding of lives tomorrow. The responsibility we face is heavy, but it is clear. To ignore it is to abandon our shared humanity. To act is to affirm that every life has value, that every child deserves safety, that every family has the right to live with dignity. The choice is not between politics and morality. It is about recognizing that true politics, the politics that serve humanity, must be grounded in morality. There is no lasting security without justice, no true stability without compassion. Let us be clear, inaction is not neutrality. To do nothing in the face of suffering is to take the side of oppression. To remain silent while civilians are displaced and starved is to declare that their lives are less important. That is why this moment demands a voice, a clear and unwavering voice that says enough. Enough of the siege. Enough of the forced evacuations. Enough of the starvation and the killing of innocents. The world has the power to push for a ceasefire, to open humanitarian corridors, to hold violators accountable, and to begin the work of building peace. What is needed is the will to do it. The people of Gaza cannot wait. Every moment of delay is another life lost, another family broken, another future destroyed. The international community must act now, with urgency and with compassion, to end the siege, to stop the forced displacement, and to protect the innocent. This is not only about Gaza, it is about who we are as a world, about whether we choose to defend life or allow cruelty to prevail. And so, let us remember silence is complicity, but action is solidarity. The people of Gaza need solidarity now, my brothers and sisters. As we reflect on the suffering unfolding in Gaza, we must remember that this is not only a political crisis, but a moral and spiritual test for all of humanity. Every faith, whether rooted in scripture or tradition, teaches us the sanctity of life, the duty to protect the weak, and the responsibility to stand against injustice. No matter what divides us, we are united by the belief that every human being is a creation of God, deserving of dignity.